you all here, in particular our guest, Professor Sylvia Fishman and her husband. And before I introduce a person who doesn't need at the JCPA really any introduction, I would like to mention our upcoming lecture of Dr. Alberto Nisman. Alberto Nisman is the Attorney General of Argentina, who is pursuing the AMIA case, which is probably the largest post-Holocaust attack on Jewry in any place in the world, in which 1994, 85 people were killed in the building of the Jewish community and 151 wounded. And he will speak Spanish and this English translation on where we are at in the AMIA bombing investigation. And as you may know, he has brought a case against the former president of Iran, Rafsanjani. Well, today's subject speaks about a future which may be that really Jewish leadership will be primarily female. Those of you who have read the JTA in the last few days have certainly seen there that at the latest Reform Convention there was a male minion, not out of tradition but out of defense. So these are new developments. When I spoke at the time to Rabbi Lam, he said to me, look, we see a blossoming of our female students much more than of the male students, so apparently it's non-denominational. The subject of Professor Sylvia Fishman's lecture will be the new gender imbalance among America's Jews, research and policy implications. Now, those of you who are veterans certainly remember her very, very interesting lecture on the transformations in the composition of American Jewish households. For those who have not read it at the time, there is here a number of copies of that very, very interesting essay, and you can take that after the lecture if you wish. Sylvia.
I'm very excited to be here sharing these data with you. This is actually the first time that I'm presenting them in a public forum, because this is research that I'm involved in doing right now. And what got me started in looking at gender issues among parents of Jewish children was a study that was done in Boston that some of you may have read about, a study of the Boston Jewish community. The factoid that got a lot of play in the press was that 60% of intermarried families said that they wanted to raise Jewish children. That was the piece that got a lot of play in many Jewish newspapers. The piece that didn't get a lot of play in Jewish newspapers that was that if you looked at those interfaith families, you saw that 9 out of 10 Jewish mothers who were married to non-Jewish men, 9 out of 10 Jewish intermarried women, said they wanted to raise Jewish children. But only about half of the Jewish men who were married to Christian women said they wanted to raise Jewish children. So it was interesting to me that that didn't get any play in the press. But I wondered to what extent the activity of doing Jewish had been transferred to women in general in the United States. In other words, was this statistic, in fact, sort of the tip of the iceberg, an indication that there had been a transference of responsibility for Jewishness from, say, 2,000 years of patriarchy to a new era, just in the United States I'm talking about, a new era of what you might call matriarchy. And if so, it really hasn't been looked at very much. It hasn't been studied, although the fact of the male minyan and the Reform Biennial in San Diego indicates that in the Reform movement, people are noticing this gender imbalance and beginning to pay attention to it. So What I'm going to share with you today is statistics which we have just run from the 2000 National Jewish Population Survey. The reason that these statistics will not match what you have seen before is because I only looked at parents with children under 13 living at home. Because a lot of religious issues don't really surface in people's minds until they have children. In fact, if they're not intensely religiously involved, very often people think religion doesn't matter to them until they have children. So I was only looking at men and women who had children under 18 living at home. And I was looking in my interview data. I also I have over 300 interviews that I've done for various research projects. I went back to those interviews to look there also at the mothers and fathers. And I looked at what both the Jews and the non-Jews said, because I interviewed non-Jewish spouses as well as Jewish spouses. So I was looking at men and women, Jewish and non-Jewish, and also whether or not these people are in marriages between two Jews and marriages between a Jew and a non-Jew. So I was looking at the intersection of a lot of different factors, and that's what I'm going to present to you this morning. Now, I want to just define a few terms before we get started. First of all, gender, when I use the word gender, it's not just a fancy word for differences in sex. Gender is the behavioral combination of activities that each society says is attached to a particular sex. So it's not the same thing as sex. And actually, Jews are a very, very good, Jewish culture is a very good way to look at the difference between sex and gender, because Jews have always defined gender in very specific ways that you wouldn't necessarily associate with that sex. So if we think about in traditional Jewish societies where maleness is defined by intellectual skills in learning certain texts, and by prayer on a regular basis, and by observing certain rituals. That's not true of every culture. In fact, most cultures don't define maleness by skill in intellectual activities. So, you know, some people were defining maleness by hunting and fishing, and Jews were defining it by being able to learn a page of Talmud. And as in most societies, femaleness, which is also a social construct, as a gender construct, was defined by not maleness. So whatever the guys were doing, the women were defined by not doing what the guys were doing. And actually we see the traditional gender roles within Jewish societies begin to change with the Haskalah, with the Jewish Enlightenment, and we especially begin to see them change in Germany, where German Jews in the 18th and 19th century begin to take on bourgeois notions of gender roles. So you see the idea that women should stay home and that men should be the primary breadwinners. That becomes a shift in gender role construction. Certainly in very pious European Jewish families prior to that, it was very common for women to work outside the home for pay. And nobody thought that made women less female, and nobody thought it made their husbands less male. But the bourgeois, the middle class ideal, which Jews began to absorb in Germany and then absorbed even more in other Western cultures, including the United States, was that the man needs to be the primary breadwinner. That's one of the definitions of maleness. And femaleness being the opposite of maleness, what defines a female is that the woman is responsible not just for the home, but also for things which were perceived as going with that domestic task. And interestingly, one of the definitions of femaleness in middle class German culture and then in the United States was that the women were responsible for passing on religious traditions. And that's where this all starts. The pattern which we're seeing coming to fruition now is one in which women are more and more seen as the religious ones, while men are less and less seen as the religious ones. So if we look at the contemporary American scene, one of the ways in which we see differences in men's and women's roles is that women now are responsible for, not to the exclusion of men, but the way it's perceived is as equally responsible for, text study, public prayer, and leadership positions. Women have become scholars. They have produced a lot of scholarship. And also there are changes in the United States, sweeping changes in the way in which women mark their life cycle events. So there is much more participation for women in many marriage ceremonies in the United States and also in Israel, as a matter of fact. Women try to incorporate more of an active role for themselves. The birth of children and naming children. At least in the United States, it is unheard of for people not to have some kind of a shalom bat, a welcoming ceremony for a female child. It seems perfectly natural and normal. Very often, these ceremonies incorporate the Seder Zevet Habat, which was always part of Sephardi culture. So it's very interesting that that is something which the Sephardim knew that you should do, but now Jews from Ashkenazi backgrounds have absorbed also. But you have to just remember 30, 40 years ago, it was not very common to do that. Bar and bat mitzvah. Bat mitzvah has made an enormous change in the United States. First of all, it's ubiquitous. Even in ultra-Orthodox settings in the United States, a person has to do something for bat mitzvah. It's now unheard of not to do something for bat mitzvah. Now, what you do depends on the wing of Judaism that you're involved in. But bat mitzvah has become ubiquitous in the United States, and one of the results of that is that women in the United States, Jewish women in the United States, now get an equal amount of Jewish education to men. The reason for that is that for a big portion of the United States, the only reason boys were sent to Hebrew school, the only reason boys were sent to supplementary schools was to prepare for the bar mitzvah. When the bat mitzvah became expected, so the girls got sent in the same way. So the bat mitzvah is not just something which marks the coming of age of the girl, but it also has had profound implications in terms of equality in educational rights. Another thing which is very, very common in the United States is women saying Kaddish. And I know it's not quite as accepted in Israel, but in the United States, again, even in Orthodox settings, it is in many modern Orthodox settings expected, and that also is a change from what was the most common behavior in times past. In terms of university settings, we now see not only women in Jewish departments of Judaica, we also see the study of things that pertain to women in departments of Judaica. So it's not just importing women in as scholars to study men's stuff, it's also that men and women now understand that looking at Jewish women's history, Jewish women's texts, the roles of Jewish women is part of what it means to learn about Jews, that women are part of actually the Jewish people, strangely enough. But what a lot of people have not paid attention to is that there has been, at the same time, a shifting downward of boys' and men's involvement in Jewish settings on many texts. Until the 1960s, boys outnumbered girls in most Jewish educational settings. Now, even if you're talking about the pre-bar mitzvah years, girls outnumber boys in Hebrew school, okay? This is a huge shift, And after bar bat mitzvah, there is really a precipitous drop. The boys just stop going. There are boys scattered here and there that go, but virtually all boys, except in Orthodox settings, stop going to religious schools after bar bat mitzvah, and a larger proportion of girls continues onward. There are some very good teen settings, and actually one of the reasons this is so upsetting is that statistically we know that you can predict from the involvement during the teenage years how involved people will be as adults. Those teen years are very, very important. It's important to have Jewish friends. It's important to be getting more Jewish information when you're at a more sophisticated level. And what we have is a drop-off of boys during those very important teen years. It's not surprising then, if you look at adult education settings, that in adult education classes, people enrolled, 2/3 to 3/4 of people enrolled in adult education in the United States are women. And the only place where you really have male domination still is at the university level. So you have a number of women there, but it still is primarily a male preserve, you might say. If we look at religious leadership, we have women rabbis and cantors in the Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative wings of Judaism. Actually, there are years where the entire Reform cantorial class has been female. They keep the rabbinic classes sort of even, male and female, but that is done very, very consciously by who you accept and who you don't accept. There still are more men than women as executives in Jewish communal settings, but again, that's done very consciously, keeping most of the high-level, lucrative jobs for men, not just out of discrimination against women, but because the leaders of the Jewish communal world in the United States don't want that to be perceived as women's work. They don't want it to become feminized. They've seen that happen in the religious world, including presidencies of synagogues, for example, which in many congregations have become primarily a job for women and applied for as women. And some of the changes that you can see in Israel include the creation of women scholars who become yoetzot halacha. They can give advice primarily to women about what are perceived as women's issues. And toanot, women who are trained both rabbinically and legally so that they can argue as advocates on behalf of women who are seeking divorces. So even though I keep saying the United States, it's because I think that in other countries these shifts have not been as sweeping, but you still see changes in other countries, including Israel. And you see the impact of feminism in other countries, although it's not always called feminism. I would say actually the people who have created programs for yoetzot halacha and toanot have been very careful to avoid using the F word, feminism, and that is one of the reasons that they have been able to accomplish what they have in terms of incorporating women. Now, one of the testimonies we have to how important gender roles are symbolically is actually fundamentalism. In a strange way, I want to mention that right now. In many religious groups, not just Judaism, but in other religious groups as well, very often the more liberal things get out there, the more rigid and even reactionary fundamentalist groups become in the way they treat their women. And that's because they use the treatment of women symbolically as a way of showing how not modern they are. If the women are treated in ways which are not modern, even less modern than they were yesterday, it allows the men much more freedom in incorporating modernity into their own lives. So that if you look in the Haredi world where restrictions on women have actually become more extreme in certain ways than they used to be, this is actually has a very, very important symbolic purpose. And it also is a very good illustration of how much gender roles are a social construction. So that, for example, if you're looking at requirements for a shidduch in certain Haredi circles for an arranged marriage, one of the questions which is now asked is, does the wife sing Shabbat Zmirot at the Shabbat table? This is the wife sing with her family at the Shabbat table. And in certain circles, these women, that girl, the young woman who lives in that household would not be acceptable if her mother sings at the Shabbat table. Now, this was not true 40 years ago. So this is just one little example of how gender roles are used symbolically, and here it's a symbol of rejecting modernity. And this is in certain ways a backlash to the phenomenon that I'm describing. In other words, liberal Judaism has become feminized. Women dominate in many liberal religious circles. And so the more right-wing traditional circles demonstrate their rejection of this whole idea of feminization by making it even more strongly a male preserve than it used to be. But it's interesting that the one thing that has escaped this reactionary impulse is women studying. That has been stamped kosher, and that it's now, even in Haredi circles, girls get quite a good Jewish education. Not the same education that boys get, but still a much better Jewish education than lots of liberal American Jews have. Another aspect of gender changes, which I think is extremely important, is that women are actually the people who have been responsible for the re-traditionalization of liberal Judaism. As women were, for many of them, the first time in their lives, getting Jewish education, as women were learning how to read from the Torah, as they were learning the tropes so that they could read from the Torah in their liberal synagogues, as women were discovering what a talit is and what tefillin are, and many of them coming to Israel to purchase those items and going back and wearing them. There was a point where you could walk into a Reform temple, and from the back, you would see that every woman was wearing a kippah that she bought in Israel, beautiful embroidered kippah, and a beautiful talit. And some of the men were. Now, many of you can remember a time when men in American Reform congregations would be prevented from wearing a head covering. Now there are baskets of kippot for men to put on if they wish to. And the people who have been the brokers reintroducing traditionalism into these Reform congregations have been the women. As the women got excited about all this learning, as they got excited about these rituals, and they did them, so their husbands and sons said, hey, maybe there's something in it. So you see the re-traditionalization of liberal American Judaism. The other factor, which is very important, is Israel. Because as the rabbis, as Reform rabbis, were trained in Israel, and as they heard melodies from Israel, and as they saw behaviors, so they brought back an affection to the United States. They brought back with them to the United States an affection for much of the traditionalism that they saw in Israel. So those two factors, feminism and greater involvement with Israel, have really transformed liberal American Judaism and have made it in certain ways much more traditional. But the downside of this, you might say, in terms of the transmission of Jewish culture, is that the women are perceived in married and intermarried families as being the primary religious actors. And what you have up on the screen is a quote from one of the interviews, and this is an in-married Jewish husband. This is a man Jewish man married to a Jewish woman who's talking about how they decided which kind of congregation to affiliate with. And he says, when we decided that we wanted to affiliate with the temple, I was very uncomfortable at first going to a Reform temple because I couldn't get used to the choir or to the organ and to the way just the whole thing was done. I don't think it mattered so much that there was a woman cantor, but it all just sounded so different. Of course, now that I have heard it, it doesn't sound like, even though at first it sounds like a church, but when you hear a church is different. And Jenny's attitude was, and this is the significant part, and Jenny's attitude was, I am going to be the one principally responsible for taking them and for being there, and I have to be comfortable with it. And that is what I am going to be comfortable with. So get comfortable with it. And I am, and it worked out. And what's significant about that quote, of course, is that we're talking here about taking children to the synagogue. This was not always the woman's job, but it is clear for both this husband and his wife, and for many of the people that I interviewed, that that's seen as what the mother does. The father isn't responsible for taking the children to the synagogue. The mother is, and that's why she's the one who is the primary decision maker. Another way in which we see shifting to the woman in terms of religious responsibility is that when you're talking about an intermarriage, the Jewish women are thinking early on about what does this mean in terms of the children that we will have. And it's very, very common in the interviews for both the Jewish wife and her non-Jewish husband to tell me the same story. And the story is, and I interview them separately so they couldn't censor each other. The story is that the Jewish woman let the potential husband know right away when they were dating, you might as well know my children are going to be Jewish. I'm going to raise Jewish children. And men didn't do that, as we'll see in a moment. So here is excerpts from 2 of the interviews where the woman says, then I said, look, if we're going to think about marriage, we need to take some steps. I need to see religion. You've got to pick one. If you're called to the Torah, you're called to the Torah as a Jew, not a Jew in something else. And actually, the initial research that I did on intermarriage and religion, I called Jewish and something else, and that's a quote from this woman. And the husband tells the same story. When we got serious, we started to discuss religion. She said the kids had to be Jewish. She felt so strongly, I knew I had to compromise because that was the way it was going to be. And that is typical of the interviews that I did with Jewish women who were married to non-Jewish men. As a result, it's not surprising that, as I mentioned, in Boston, in intermarried families, half the Jewish fathers want to raise Jewish children compared to 9 out of 10 of the Jewish mothers. And you see the result of that at the other end in a survey that was done of Jewish college freshmen. And what that's across the United States, and what that survey found was that of children of freshmen who said they were Jewish, okay, in the United States, there's no religion question on the census. So this is kids that when they registered in college and they filled out a form, and it's optional to put down religion, they put down Jewish. 15% of those who had a Jewish father but a non-Jewish mother said that they were Jewish, and 40% of those who had a Jewish mother but not a Jewish father said they were Jewish. So you see the result of Jewish mothers versus Jewish fathers in that statistic. One of the things I found when I went back to my interviews is that both the Christian women and the Jewish women liked religion better than the fathers did. Jewish men and non-Jewish men, both of them, were more likely to say that they were ambivalent about organized religion. They weren't that crazy about organized religion. If they could have a household without any attachment to organized religion, just a secular household, they would have been fine with that. Both the Christian mothers and the Jewish mothers said they thought it was a good idea to have some religion for the children, that it was healthier to raise children with some religion. Now, I will say that those differences were much less pronounced in married families. In other words, when it was a Jewish man married to a Jewish woman, those men were much less negative about organized religion than the Jewish men who had married non-Jewish women. And this becomes a motif that you are going to see in the other data as well. And here's an example of a Christian woman who said, and this is very, very typical, all the quotes that I picked are typical quotes. I wanted our children raised with some kind of religious background. My husband didn't really care whether or not they were raised with religion, but he said, if there is going to be a religion, they've got to be Jewish, because I would feel weird having a Christian child. Now, this was the way it was. Jewish women thought, I want a Jewish child. And the Jewish men who were intermarried said, I don't want a Christian child. So you could say that the Jewish mothers were proactive and the intermarried Jewish men were reactive. They would have been happy if the children had no religion, but it really just freaked them out to think that their child was going to be baptized. And so they ended up coming to it with it was a negative, what they didn't want, whereas for the Jewish mothers it was a positive, it was what they did want. And this Christian woman said, she sees this with all of her friends too. The men don't want Christian children for a cultural reason. It's kind of a masculine thing. All right, so here you see from the National Jewish Population Survey, one of the questions that was asked that actually has not been explored in any of the literature that I know of is a question on who makes the decision about your child's religion. What you see here is the green is people who said that both I and my spouse make the decision about my child's religion. And the blue is I personally make the decision about my child's religion. So what you see here is that and this is in intermarried families. So intermarried families that are affiliated with any wing of Judaism, okay? Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and most intermarried families, the largest number of intermarried families are affiliated with the Reform movement. What you see is that the mothers, 59% of them say, I make the decision about my child's religion, okay? The fathers who are affiliated with any wing of Judaism, only 22% of them say that they make the primary decision, and 63% of them say that both the spouses together make the decision. So you see there very clearly how the mothers take it upon themselves, and it's their business. It basically has nothing to do with their husband. They're deciding what religion their children are going to be and going to be Jewish. You see there's a big difference when we look at the unaffiliated. Okay, so even in intermarried families, there's a big difference between those that affiliate and those that don't affiliate. Now, if we're looking at the in-married family, so these are two Jews married to each other, here we see much more across the board that both spouses together decide the child's religion. Well, if you're talking about in-married families, they're almost all Jewish children. So it's not really that significant, except psychologically.